Story: The Weight of the Ancestral Stone. The sun hung low over the scorched plains of the Magadha kingdom, where the red dust rose in silent clouds beneath the feet of a solitary traveler named Ananda, who was not the monk but a seeker of another kind. He carried upon his shoulders a large, smooth stone, which he believed was the physical manifestation of his family's honor and the weight of his father's unfulfilled ambitions. As he walked the narrow dirt roads lined with ancient banyan trees, he felt the gravity of this burden pressing into his very soul, and he observed how his mind constructed a narrative of duty and sacrifice that justified his exhaustion. He passed through small villages where the smell of wood smoke and parched earth filled the air, and he saw the Buddha sitting beneath a tree with a countenance of such profound stillness that it seemed to anchor the entire landscape. The traveler stopped, and his mind began to churn with the complexity of his internal struggle, wondering why his heart felt like a parched well while he performed what he considered to be the ultimate act of filial piety. He noticed the way his thoughts looped in recursive patterns of resentment and pride, and he began to see that the stone was not heavy because of its mass, but because of the mental inheritance he refused to set down. The movement of his mind was like a river caught in an eddy, spinning in circles of past conversations and perceived slights that had occurred long before he was born. He realized that the karma of his family was not a mystical force from the heavens, but the habitual repetition of these very thoughts, which he nurtured in the secret chambers of his consciousness. The Buddha did not speak, but his presence acted as a mirror, reflecting the traveler's own agitation and the unnecessary complexity of his inner world. As the traveler watched the silent monk, he felt the rigid structures of his identity beginning to soften, and the mental grip he held on the stone started to loosen like dry soil crumbling in a late summer breeze. He understood that by carrying the stone, he was merely recreating the suffering of his ancestors, and that true liberation lay in the recognition of the mind's capacity to release the stories it tells itself about who it must be. The internal landscape shifted from a place of arid struggle to a vast open space where the concept of the self was no longer tethered to the weight of the past. He saw how his mind had been a theater of ghosts where he played every part and suffered every blow in a play that had ended years ago. The realization was not a sudden explosion, but a slow thawing of the ice that had encased his perception for decades. He stood on the dusty road, and for the first time he perceived the silence between his thoughts as a sanctuary rather than a void. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows stretched long across the earth, but the traveler no longer felt the need to measure his progress by the distance traveled or the weight carried. He saw that the essence of his existence was not defined by the shadows of his lineage, but by the quality of his awareness in the present moment. This awareness was a luminous thread that could disentangle the knots of generations if only he allowed the mind to rest in its natural state of non-attachment. He placed the stone on the ground not with anger, but with a profound sense of gratitude for the lesson it had provided, and he walked forward into the gathering dusk with a step so light it barely disturbed the dust of the ancient path. The mechanics of his mind were now transparent, and he could see the gears of desire and aversion slowing down until they reached a state of perfect equilibrium. He was no longer a servant to the ghosts of his family, but a witness to the unfolding of a new reality, where karma was not a prison, but a path to understanding the interconnectedness of all things. The stillness of the evening air mirrored the stillness within him, and he knew that the journey home was not a physical distance to be covered, but a psychological return to the source of being where no burdens exist and no stories are told. He watched as the mental constructs of obligation and debt dissolved into the vastness of the night sky, leaving only the pure resonance of a consciousness that had finally learned to breathe. Every step he took now was an act of creation rather than a repetition of the past, and the ancient earth seemed to rise up to meet him in a gesture of silent approval. The traveler understood that the greatest gift he could offer his family was not the preservation of their pain, but the courage to be free from it. This was the true nature of his journey, and as he disappeared into the shadows of the forest, he carried nothing but the light of his own awakening. Story: the mirror of the silent stream. Beside the gentle currents of the Niranjana river, a woman named Sumana sat in deep contemplation as the silver light of the moon danced upon the water's surface, reflecting the turbulent waves within her own heart. She had spent many years harboring a cold resentment toward her sister, believing that the discord in their family was a result of external circumstances and the choices made by those around her. As she watched the ripples move outward, she began to observe the subtle mechanics of her own mind and how it compulsively reconstructed the same memories of betrayal and hurt until they became a solid wall between her and the world. She saw that her mind was like a weaver, perpetually spinning a dark thread of victimhood, and that this internal entanglement was the true source of the karma that bound her family together in a cycle of suffering. The Buddha sat nearby under the shade of a flowering jasmine tree, his presence a silent testament to the possibility of a mind that does not cling to the phantoms of the past. Sumana noticed how her thoughts would seize upon a single word or gesture from years ago and amplify it until it drowned out the quiet beauty of the present moment. She began to realize that the person she was angry with was not the sister who existed now, but a mental image she had created and sustained with her own energy. This realization felt like the breaking of a long drought, and she felt a sudden rush of clarity as she saw that the knots in her relationships were merely reflections of the knots in her own awareness. The movement of her mind shifted from a state of defensive reaction to one of expansive observation, and she began to trace the roots of her anger back to their origin in her own fears and insecurities. She saw that karma was not a punishment inflicted by an external judge, but the natural consequence of her mind's own movements and the habits of thought she chose to cultivate. The river continued to flow indifferent to her internal struggle, and she understood that life too was a continuous stream that her mind was trying to freeze into static images of right and wrong. As she allowed herself to simply watch the flow without judgment, she felt the tension in her chest begin to dissolve, and the heavy clouds of resentment started to dissipate like morning mist. She perceived that the healing of her family did not require an apology or a change in her sister's behavior, but a fundamental shift in her own perception. By releasing the need to be right, she opened a space where compassion could naturally arise, and she saw that the other members of her family were also caught in their own webs of mental habits. The insight was profound and silent, and it changed the very texture of her being as she realized that she was the architect of her own emotional reality. She looked at the Buddha and saw that his equanimity was not a state of indifference, but a state of total presence that allowed all things to be as they are, without the need for control. Her mind, which had once been a battlefield, became a quiet garden where the seeds of understanding could finally take root. She felt a sense of immense freedom as she understood that the past had no power over her except for the power she gave it through her own thoughts. The silence of the night was no longer empty, but filled with the resonance of a mind that had found its way back to balance. She saw that the true nature of her relationship with her family was a shared journey of learning, and that every conflict was an opportunity to see more deeply into the workings of the ego. The river whispered secrets of impermanence, and she listened with a heart that was finally open to the truth of the moment. There was no longer a need to hold on to the old stories or to protect the fragile image of the self that had been wounded. She was a part of the flow, and the flow was a part of her, and in that recognition, the karma of generations was transformed into the wisdom of the present. The moonlight seemed to grow brighter as she sat in the stillness, and she knew that when she returned to her home, she would not be the same woman who had left it. Her movements would be guided by a new clarity, and her words would carry the fragrance of peace rather than the sting of old grievances. The mind had returned to its source, and in that return, the world was made whole again. Story: the architecture of the unseen wall. Within the sun-drenched courtyards of a merchant manor in the city of Shravasti, a man named Vardhana observed the silent play of his young son, who was meticulously building a miniature fortress out of smooth river stones and dried clay. As the child labored with a furrowed brow and a tense jaw, Vardhana felt a sudden and unsettling recognition of his own internal landscape reflected in the boy's concentrated agitation. He began to examine the subtle mechanics of his own awareness, perceiving how his lifelong pursuit of security and status had not been a path toward peace, but a constant reinforcement of a mental fortress designed to keep the world at bay. The movement of his mind was characterized by a relentless scanning for potential threats and a compulsive need to accumulate resources, as if the mere presence of material wealth could provide a shield against the inherent impermanence of existence. He saw that this deep-seated anxiety, which he had always labeled as prudence, was in fact a toxic substrate that had seeped into the consciousness of his family, creating an atmosphere of scarcity even amidst their great abundance. The Buddha was known to stay at the nearby Jetavana monastery, and Vardhana had often heard the monks speak of the way the mind colors reality with the pigments of its own latent tendencies. He sat on a carved wooden bench and allowed his gaze to soften, watching the way his thoughts would rise like heat shimmers from the earth, forming elaborate structures of worry about his son's future and his family's reputation. He realized that the karma he was passing down was not a set of external circumstances, but the very rhythm of this grasping mind which taught his son that the world was a place to be conquered rather than experienced. The architecture of his inner world was composed of these invisible walls built brick by brick with every moment of judgment and every instance of fearful clinging. He observed how his mind would react to the child's small failures with a sharp pang of disappointment, revealing his own attachment to a perfect image of success that he had never truly achieved. This internal pressure was a silent command to the boy to carry the weight of his father's unfulfilled desires, and Vardhana felt a profound sense of sorrow as he witnessed the cycle of suffering beginning anew in the next generation. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant sound of temple bells, but Vardhana's focus remained inward as he practiced the art of watching the watcher. He saw that the self he was trying to protect was nothing more than a collection of habitual responses, and that the wall he had built was actually a prison that separated him from the very people he claimed to love. The realization was like a slow erosion of the clay walls his son was building as he understood that true protection lay in the transparency of the mind rather than its fortification. He felt the rigid boundaries of his identity beginning to dissolve, and the space within him expanded to include the child and the garden and the distant hills in a single field of non-judgmental awareness. He saw that by changing the quality of his own attention, he could alter the psychic climate of his entire household, and that the greatest act of love was to provide a space of stillness where his son could grow without the shadow of his father's fears. The movement of his mind slowed to a gentle hum, and the static of his constant calculations faded into a deep and resonant silence. He understood that karma was the momentum of the mind's own habits, and that this momentum could be interrupted by the simple act of presence. As he sat there, he was no longer a merchant or a father or a master of a house, but a witness to the unfolding of a reality that was far more vast and interconnected than his narrow fortress had ever allowed him to see. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, and Vardhana felt a lightness in his chest that he had not known since his own childhood. He watched his son knock over the stone fortress and laugh as the pieces scattered across the dirt, and for the first time, Vardhana did not feel the need to correct him or to rebuild the wall. He saw the beauty in the collapse and the freedom in the ruins, and he knew that the path to a better life for his family began with his own willingness to stand in the open air of the present moment without a shield or a stone. The mind had finally stopped building, and in that cessation, the world was revealed as it truly was, a seamless flow of light and shadow where nothing is lost because nothing is truly possessed. he felt a deep gratitude for the child who had been his teacher and for the silent Buddha who had provided the map to this inner liberation. The evening grew cool, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Vardhana remained in his seat, a man who had finally found his home by letting go of the house he had built in his mind. Story: The Weaver of the Silent Loom. In a small village nestled on the banks of the Ganges, a woman named Malati spent her days at a loom of dark wood, her fingers moving with a precision that had been honed over 3 decades of repetitive labor. As she worked, she began to notice how the tension in her shoulders and the sharpness of her breathing were woven into the very fabric she produced, and she realized that her internal state was a subtle vibration that influenced everything she touched. She observed the movement of her mind as she thought about the discord between her 2 daughters who lived in the same house but spoke to each other through the cold language of silence. She saw that her own mind was like a loom that was constantly weaving a pattern of comparison and favoritism, even when she believed she was being fair and impartial. This internal weaving was a complex process of mental events where every preference and every subtle rejection created a knot in the psychic fabric of her family. The Buddha was passing through the village on his way to the Vulture Peak, and as Malati watched the monks walk in single file with their eyes cast down, she felt a deep longing for the stillness they embodied. She began to pay closer attention to the way her thoughts would jump from one grievance to another, like a shuttle moving back and forth across the warp threads of her consciousness. She perceived that her daughter's conflict was not a separate event, but a continuation of the same discordant rhythm that she carried within herself. The mind's mechanics were revealed to her as a series of cause and effect loops where a single thought of irritation would trigger a cascade of defensive reactions in those around her. She saw that she had been trying to fix the external fabric of her family's relationships without ever addressing the tension in the weaver herself. The air in the hut was thick with the scent of raw cotton, and the sound of the river was a constant backdrop to her introspection. She noticed how her mind would project its own dissatisfaction onto the girls, blaming them for the lack of peace in the home, while she herself was a fountain of restless energy. As she allowed this realization to penetrate her heart, she felt a sudden softening in her hands, and the shuttle moved with a new and more graceful ease. She began to understand that the karma of her family was held together by the glue of her own mental habits, and that by releasing the habit of judgment, she could dissolve the bonds of their mutual suffering. The movement of her mind shifted from the horizontal plane of past and future to the vertical plane of pure presence, where the only thing that existed was the sensation of the thread passing through her fingers. She saw that the silence between her daughters was not a void to be filled with words, but a mirror of the silence she was now cultivating within herself. This inner quiet was not an absence of sound, but a presence of awareness that allowed all things to be as they were without the need for manipulation. She realized that her influence on her family was not through what she said or did, but through the quality of the space she held for them. If her mind was a loom of peace, then the life they shared would naturally reflect that pattern. The insight was like a cool breeze on a humid afternoon, and she felt the heavy burden of responsibility for her children's happiness transform into a simple commitment to her own clarity. She watched the river flow past and saw it as a metaphor for the mind's potential to be both a source of life and a force of destruction, depending on its own current. She chose to be the still point in the center of the flow, and as she did so, she felt the invisible threads of tension that connected her to her daughters begin to slacken. The loom continued to click and clack, but the sound was no longer an intrusion, but a rhythmic meditation that anchored her in the now. She saw that the path to healing her family was not a destination to be reached, but a way of being in each moment. The fabric she was weaving now was different from any she had made before, and it carried a texture of serenity that was palpable to anyone who touched it. When her daughters eventually entered the room, they did not find a mother who was waiting to judge them or to mediate their disputes, but a woman who was as vast and welcoming as the sky. In that space of non-attachment, the old grievances had no place to land, and the sisters found themselves speaking in tones that were softer and more kind. Melody smiled but did not look up from her work, knowing that the true weaver had finally found the perfect thread. Story: The Echo of the Hidden Valley. High within the rugged folds of the Himalayan foothills, where the air was thin and the silence was as heavy as the ancient stones, a man named Keshava made his way toward a remote monastery with a heart that felt like a clenched fist. He had spent 40 years of his life building a legacy for his sons, only to find that his presence in the family home was met with a cold and brittle distance that he could not understand. As he navigated the narrow mountain paths, he observed the internal dialogue that raced through his mind, a relentless stream of justification and blame that sought to protect his ego from the pain of rejection. He perceived how his mind would reach back into the past to collect instances of his own generosity and use them as weapons against the perceived ingratitude of his children. This mental accounting was a complex and exhausting process, and Keshava began to see that his mind was not a sanctuary but a courtroom where he was both the judge and the primary witness in a trial that never ended. He found the Buddha sitting in the mouth of a cave where the shadows were deep and the only sound was the distant rush of a glacial stream. The traveler stopped and stood in the presence of that profound stillness, and he felt the frantic energy of his thoughts beginning to collide with the vastness of the monk's equanimity. He noticed how his mind would attempt to fill the silence with explanations and grievances, but the Buddha remained as immovable as the mountain itself. In that space of non-reaction, Keshava began to perceive the true nature of the discord within his family, seeing it not as an external conflict, but as a psychological resonance of his own internal state. He realized that the authority he had tried to exert over his sons was born of a deep fear of his own insignificance, and that his demands for respect were merely echoes of his own inner shouting. The mechanics of his consciousness were laid bare as he watched the way a single thought of pride would ripple outward, creating a wave of defensiveness in the imaginary versions of his sons he held in his mind. He saw that he had never actually seen his children for who they were because he was too busy looking at the reflections of his own expectations. This insight was a sharp and cold clarity that pierced through the layers of his self-deception, and he felt the physical sensation of his heart beginning to soften like ice under a persistent sun. He understood that the karma of his family was the habitual vibration of these very thoughts, and that he could not demand a peace from them that he had not first established within himself. The movement of his mind shifted from a desire to control the narrative to a willingness to simply witness the unfolding of the present moment. He saw that the distance between him and his sons was a space he had created with his own judgments, and that this space could only be closed by the cessation of his own mental grasping. The stillness of the mountain air seemed to enter his very marrow, and he realized that the legacy he truly needed to leave was not one of wealth or status, but one of an unburdened and transparent awareness. He watched as the mental constructs of fatherhood and duty dissolved into the simple reality of being, and he felt a profound sense of relief as the weight of his own armor fell away. The sun began to set behind the jagged peaks, casting a purple glow over the valley, and Keshava knew that his journey back down the mountain would be a different kind of movement altogether. He was no longer a man seeking to reclaim his place at the head of a table, but a soul seeking to be the quiet center of a shared life. He understood that true influence was not found in the strength of his voice, but in the depth of his silence, and that by changing the frequency of his own mind, he would naturally alter the atmosphere of his home. The internal shouting had stopped, and in its place was a vast and resonant openness that could hold the complexities of his family without the need to fix or change them. He stood up and bowed to the silent Buddha, not as a follower, but as a man who had finally recognized the teacher within his own awareness. Every step he took now was a practice in letting go, and the mountain path seemed to welcome his lightened tread. He saw that the healing of his lineage was not a task to be completed, but a state of grace to be inhabited, and he walked into the twilight with a heart that was finally at rest. Story: the clarity of the shared well. At the edge of a village in the kingdom of Kosala, an elderly woman